So tonight's webinar is a special themed webinar to mark the first day of LGBT History Month, as we've reached the month of February in this weird and wonderful year. It's a national event and a charity, LGBT History Month, that works on to promote equality and diversity for the benefit of the public. They work this into all of their charitable aims and themes, which if you visit the website, which is fully available, you can get more details about that. But I do also believe that our first speaker this evening will be talking about it further. The importance of community archives and allowing people to explore their heritage is clearly evidenced within the LGBT history and heritage. As we will be hearing this evening from all of our speakers, the need to create these safe spaces to preserve and collect our LGBT heritage is becoming evident and incredibly important within our communities to mark the political and social change that the LGBT History Month can be seen to be having across the entirety of the UK. And unfortunately, largely, it's been invisible and unacknowledged within our historical accounts. But thanks to the good work of many people that are here tonight and across the country, this hopefully will start to change. So enough of me waffling on. We would like to invite our first speaker to the floor, Dan Vo, who amongst his many roles as patron of the LGBT History Month, as I said earlier. And tonight he will talk about Queer Britain and our archive and the archive at Bishopsgate Institution. So I welcome you, Dan Vo.
Thank you very much. Oh, yay, applause. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here with you because there's a lot for me to get through, but it is the first day of LGBT plus History Month, and what a first day it's been. It's just gone bonkers today. There's just been so much happening on the social media, which is great. And I believe this is the first year that we've actually got an emoji as well. So you type in hashtag LGBTHM21. Oh, there's variations of that as well, but that's my preferred hashtag. If you type it in, you'll see that there's a book that is nice and open, and each of the pages of the book are the colors of the Progress flag as well. So it includes black and brown and the colors of the trans pride flag, as well as the more standard 6 colored rainbow flag that we've got. So how exciting and fun, and what a great way for us at LGBT plus History Month to be able to celebrate what is effectively also our 16th birthday. So sweet 16, we got an emoji from social media, which is great. So I'm going to now share my screen with you and show you just talk a little bit about some of the work that has been happening at the moment. And funnily enough, I already forgot what it was that I was talking about. So we're going to go slightly off piece, but we'll come back to it. So let me just make sure that this is all ready for presenter view and share it with you now. So I'm going to wear 3 caps today. One is from LGBT plus History Month. Another is as part of the Queer Heritage and Collections Network, which I think is quite relevant to this group. And the other as part of Queer Britain. And as you know, it's to talk about the importance of community archives. And I really wanted to start with the Queer Heritage and Collections Network because I hope that it will give a way for those of you who are dialed in from community archives to be able to reach out to the network and engage with us. We just had our symposium just about a month ago, and as you can see, the speakers were wonderful. The list of speakers that you can see here. I'll make sure that I can drop a program into the chat for you just as soon as I finish speaking, so that you can access the talks as well, because it's really about looking at how we can access LGBTQ plus history and heritage across the whole of the UK. It is supported by the Art Fund, the Queer Heritage Collections Network is, and it is founded by English Heritage, Historic England, Historic Royal Palaces, National Trust, and the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries. Don't be confused by by having 2 partners though that have the word English in them. We are across the entirety of the UK, and as you can see, we've only just we were born in the middle of lockdown number 1 in the UK, and already we have over 50 collections that are engaged with us. Now, what's really interesting is that these collections range from some of the greatest nationals that we've got, the biggest nationals rather, some of the biggest nationals, and then you've got lots of community-based archives as well, and those that are attached to local councils as well. So that's really interesting to have such a strong mix of types of collections as well. You've also got some that sort of look at science more, others look more at art. And I think that's really interesting to have a great mix as well. And so what I think the organization, which by the way is free to become a member, so if you're part of a community collection, please do think about joining us. It is free. What we really want to encourage is an idea of how each organization can support each other. So if you've got particular things, and I'm sure as we speak to some of the other collections today, the archives today, you'll find that there are particular things that are of particular concern. Our idea is to sort of match people together, to do some matchmaking and to find organizations who have been through that before in order to support exactly what it is that you want to achieve with your projects this year. And coming to what we're doing right now this month, I wanted to kind of just talk about the LGBT plus History Month icons just very quickly. There is the wonderful website that you can go to, of course, throughout all this month, and you will be fully supported by a range of things that you can be able to watch and also share with your local communities. There's going to be also lots of resources in terms of schoolroom resources. So if you're one of the people who are kind of stuck indoors at the moment having to homeschool, well, we have put together some packs along with the Child Trust based in Manchester. They've helped put together some wonderful at-home resources that you can be using as well. So I will also now show you the icons just here. There's 5 icons that are picked. There is one that relates specifically to Plymouth, so I will show a video of that just shortly, but do go to the website to have a see of all the people who are involved in this year and the way that we're telling a rich story of local stories as well, rich local stories. For me, it all started with this lot here, and I just love popping up this slide because this is the thing that we all miss, isn't it? Being able to bring people into our collection, to be able to enjoy the history that we have been collecting for them and be able to share it with our communities. These are wonderful punters who have come to celebrate LGBTQ+ History Month was it last year? It might have been the year before, but this is me at the V&A, and you can see that there's a cluster of volunteers at the top here about to split a huge audience of people who've come to celebrate LGBTQ+ history. And for me at the V&A, I look after the volunteer guides there that share the history there. For us, having resources from the collection, but also being able to connect with community archives is really important, because for us, the belief is the idea that our history has always been there, and our history is across place, time, and culture. And so being able to tell a rich, nuanced history of LGBTQ+ history in all of the archives of the museum, it is really about engaging with lots and lots of different archives and collections from across the country in order to collect those stories, in order to find those stories, in order to be able to share those stories. And it really kind of is an idea that I was very proud to be able to work with collections across the country, really. And so this is the team that exists at the Emgeerdwe CAHG, the National Museum Cardiff. We managed to launch LGBTQ+ tours just before lockdown last year. As you can see, it's a wonderful, joyous bunch of wonderful locals who tell the history of Wales, but also beyond as well. We always try to look for those elements of intersectionality as well. So when we go into the collections, it's also looking at how our local stories connect up with international stories as well. And at the moment, if you go to the website for National Museum Cardiff as well and National Museum Wales, you will be able to see that there's a collecting program at the moment that is seeking to collect local stories from local Welsh people as well. I think it's a general idea that you can see across lots of collections. So here is a Cambridge team across 7 collections. So again, I mentioned there are, how do you tell LGBTQ+ history in a zoology museum or a science museum or a polar museum? Well, it is possible to do, and it is remarkable to do. And it's often being able to go back into the archives and look at everyday stories and recognize the importance of everyday stories, and recognizing that those who weren't given a spotlight in the past, those who were, sometimes working alongside more famous names, but those who kept diaries and those who made observations, those are the people that we can now help highlight as well. And they are the people of color, the LGBTQ+ scientists as well, for example. And that really is what we're trying to do, sort of expand what is considered to be history. by being to say that there's a more plural history to be told. And so I'm delighted to sort of be able to work with so many different collections across the country to be able to say that it is about everyday stories. And this just happens to be the very last project that I did with Gunnison Park Museum, where we were very much looking at a very specialized local history, where it was only LGBTQ plus people that had ever lived or set foot in Hounslow and Ealing, because that's where the museum has its footprint across two particular boroughs. And even in such a narrow little footprint, when you think of how big the map is of where we're looking at across these 50 collections, it is still possible to celebrate very diverse stories that people are incredibly interested in. And for me, that's also the ethos of Queer Britain. And so being able to put that hat on now, it's the idea that we are trying to collect a very plural idea of what it means to be LGBTQ+, what it means to be queer in Britain. And in doing that, we're very much saying that your story is incredibly important, and we want to know what the experience is for you right now. And at the moment, because of the situation that we're in, it does mean us asking what it means for you to be in lockdown. And we are doing two particular projects at the moment that might be of interest. One is with the Post Office and also Levi's UK supporting us to collect letters. They're called Open Letters to Queer Britain. And you can look that up online. And we're asking effectively for you just to write a letter of what it's like for you right now to be LGBTQ+. Another project that we're doing is actually with Goldsmiths University and also Kent State University in the US. And this one's an academic-based research. It's a little bit more rigorous. We're asking for a little bit more, but we're asking for you to engage with the MA students who do the only queer history course in the UK at Goldsmiths. It's for you to have a sit down with them and to collect your oral history. So they will ask you the sort of the standard oral history questions, and as part of that is to encapsulate as many perspectives as we can. And I think that's an ethos that I think a lot of community archives do incredibly well. I think that's the thing that really enables us as historians to go back to and be able to see really specific nuanced histories. And that's the most wonderful and beautiful thing. And being able to work, for example, with Pride in Plymouth, when we had the selection for LGBT plus History Month, and we said Mark Weston will be one of the icons because the theme is body, mind, and spirit. And we wanted to have somebody who really encapsulates the full idea of both body, triplicate of body, mind, and spirit. We thought Mark Weston, the Devonshire Wonder, would be just absolutely wonderful. And having the collection of Pride in Plymouth and being able to work with them, Alan Butler will talk shortly, but I'm about to show you a video that we worked together with Eric, a local, I'm going to say historian, but a local activist for local history. I think is just absolutely wonderful. So I'm going to finish now by handing over to Eric and showing you just a little bit of this wonderful video. And hopefully, actually, I'm just going to stop share for a second and I'm going to reshare, just making sure that I've got sound enabled. There we go.
Hi, my name's Eric. I'm a 22-year-old transgender man. I was born and raised in Plymouth, and I'm living here currently, and I'm here to talk about Mark Weston's story. A trans man in the 1930s, I read his story as a teenager, and I think it had a very profound effect on me as a young trans man. Especially someone who was so successful, like an Olympian, and he medically transitioned and he had a wife. Just so much of LGBT history, especially trans history, has been kind of erased or lost or just was undocumented. Seeing these stories and preserving these stories feels especially important, and it would be great for kind of future generations of trans people to know more about the origins of the community as well. I've been involved with Pride in Plymouth for quite a long time. I first got involved through a youth group when I was about 13, I think, and I'm very excited about the Rainbow Connections exhibition in the Box. The Box is a local museum, and the aim of the project is to kind of pass down more information about trans history from generation to generation. Hopefully, young trans people in the future will be able to have more of a sense of their local heritage. I think when I first came out, I assumed that I must be the first and only trans person in Plymouth. So by the time I'd read Mark's story, I'd met other trans people living in Plymouth, but to see the kind of representation in the archive of a man like myself who'd transitioned back in the 30s as well. It helped me shed sort of an alienated feeling. I suddenly felt like I had a history in the town, and it definitely helped foster kind of a sense of community and belonging in Plymouth.
So there you are. I think what a wonderful way to just sum up everything. It's very much that idea of the local stories that we collect and being able to show that we've always been here. And then that impact that it has for a current generation and young people, I'm going to say like Eric, young people like Eric, and how that impacts their own sense of self, and them being able to take that to the next generation, I think is absolutely wonderful. So Alan, thank you very much for having introduced us to Eric and having helped us share the story of Mark Weston for LGBT+ History Month this year.
No, thank you, Dan. That was wonderful. Quick round of applause, everybody. I know this wonderful thing. You do it either way. That's amazing. We have time for some questions. If anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or put the hand up emoji. I think we have, is it Maria's got her hand up? No? Are they all just waving?
I think Vicky might have her hand up, but she might be clapping. I don't know.
Just clapping.
Just
right.
clapping.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of time. You can carry on asking questions if something comes up later, and put it in the chat, or hopefully we will have time for a small panel discussion at the end where you can ask any questions that come up during. Right. So I guess we'll go on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Orla Agin. She joins us this evening from Cork LGBT Archive. I'm not going to give you loads of spiel and spoil her talk, so I shall hand straight over to Orla.
Thank you. I just realised I needed to unmute myself. So hi everybody, and I'm your non-UK contributor for the night. So coming to you from the south coast of Ireland. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about the Cork LGBT Archive. And there are, lots of different, hang on, sorry, trying to get this to move, and I seem, okay. So there's a number of different aspects to the Cork LGBT Archive, physical collection, digital archive, exhibition, book, various things. So I'm going to talk you through some of those different bits, but I'm going to start with the beginning and kind of the motivation and the beginnings for this project. And I suppose I created the Cork LGBT Archive because I was aware that there was this incredibly rich history of LGBT activism and community formation, but that it was a hidden history, that it wasn't a history that we could find in the archives or in the historical accounts. So I wanted to acknowledge and to share and preserve that history, and to give voices to the unheard voices. And I suppose I was also very conscious of the need to move the narrative beyond the capital-centric focus, similar in lots of ways to the kind of Queer Beyond London project in the UK, but very much around acknowledging the fact that so much of LGBT activism doesn't actually happen in capitals. This was the other beginning. So this is the basement of Arthur Leahy's house. And Arthur had the foresight to start collecting items to do with the LGBT community and activism in Cork from the 1970s onwards. But as you can see, it wasn't exactly stored in optimal conditions. But it was this incredible treasure trove. So he kind of let me at it. And I suppose there was quite an urgency with it because a lot of the material was starting to get damaged because it was in this damp basement. So the first kind of steps were really just starting to try and get it out of the basement and starting to get some kind of order on it so that we could see what was there and start to access it. So there was a lot of work just of kind of taking it out of the basement and starting that whole process of cataloguing and sorting the material. So kind of alongside that, I kind of simultaneously, I was creating a digital archive because I wanted to be able to kind of showcase some of the material that was in the archive, and be able to get people kind of interested in this project. So literally I was picking up a box, no idea what was in it, putting my hands tentatively into it, taking material out, scanning it and putting it on an archive. And, you know, there was a bit of work in trying to figure out how this would get set up, but I was really committed to the idea of creating a low cost, low tech model because I had no money, and but also that it was a model that could easily be replicated by other community archives, but also one that was easy for other people to learn how to use. So I set it up using Omeka on Reclaim Hosting. And, you know, it created this tool to be able to create an opportunity for people instantly to engage with items from the collection, and also to be able to create a number of online exhibits so that people could look at, like, this is a range of materials to do with the 1981 National Gay Conference in Cork. So you have the conference poster, the conference pack, you have the ticket from the gala ball, you also have the conference report and the leaflet, all of those kinds of things. So there's a lot of material to do with a particular event that people can engage with. In creating the digital archive, I was obviously looking at the whole thing of the metadata system and looking at the kind of recommendations that there were around kind of controlled vocabularies, and seeing so clearly how unsuitable they often were for queer projects and for LGBT communities, which led me to the Homosaurus, which was developed initially by the IHLA in Amsterdam, and then has been kind of developed further from that. And I think a really brilliant resource in terms of a kind of like queer vocabulary for using in digital archives. So, you know, this work was evolving kind of over a couple of years, but I was really conscious of this whole thing of needing to try and keep the collection safe, both the physical collection and the digital one. So, you know, we moved it out of the basement, a little bit of organizing, but I had a temporary space that I was using in a university, and then lost that space. So I had nowhere really to work on it. So it needed a home to keep it safe. So it's now been donated to the Cork Public Museum, and they're going to finish the job of the cataloguing and sorting it. And once they finish that, they will enable public access to the collection. And the thing that I'm really excited about is that they have made a firm commitment to create a permanent Cork LGBT exhibition in the museum. So all the Cork school kids that get dragged in for their school visit to the museum will also see the LGBT exhibition. And then in terms of the digital collection, you know, I went to a preservation conference in London years ago, and my biggest learning in it was that I didn't have the skills, resources, or time to ensure the long-term digital preservation of this collection. So I wanted to add it to the National Digital Repository, and was lucky enough to win their inaugural DRI Community Archive Scheme. So the collection has now been added to the DRI, and that enables the long-term digital preservation because they have the skills to do that, but also the greater kind of visibility for the collection and greater access to it. And then from the DRI, the collection was then also added on to Europeana. So again, in terms of like constantly increasing the visibility of that community and increasing also the LGBT collections that were in Europeana, so that that collection then becomes more queer. So I'm conscious of trying to get through a lot in a short time. So I do all this great work, but there's not much point if people don't know about it. So one of the things for me was about creating multiple ways for people to engage with the collection. And conscious of the fact that people like to do that in lots of different ways. So people can engage through the digital archive, both the Cork LGBT archive, but then also through the DRI and Europeana. And I like the whole fact that Omika is a Swahili word that literally means displaying your wares, you know, so I kind of feel like I'm displaying my wares for people to engage with. Then also kind of, you know, sharing information and items that are added through social media accounts. And then in 2016, I created the first Cork LGBT Archive exhibition, and again, with no money. So what I did was a very friendly queer in the college was going on holidays and loaned me his colour printer. So I printed items from the archive on photographic material and stuck them on the walls in this community art centre. But it was just amazing for people to see their history reflected on the walls and for people to be able to take this journey through the development of the community from the 70s through to the 80s and into the 90s. And then since then, I've managed to produce a little bit more portable version of the exhibition. So there's a series of 6 banners, which kind of again trace that history through the 70s, 80s and 90s. And that's been on display in lots of different places. So kind of starting in kind of various venues in Cork. And a really, really, really positive response to these exhibitions, you know, in terms of people seeing their history reflected, but also then in terms of it being part of that wider Irish heritage, because the exhibition was held as part of the Irish Heritage Week in 2016 and was actually shortlisted for a Hidden History Award for that year. So it was, went on tour a little bit, went to Belfast City Hall, and then in 2019 to the LGBT Arms Conference in Berlin. So then another way for people to kind of engage with the Cork LGBT Archive is from me giving presentations in lots of different venues, and I'm kind of realizing I should be adding Zoom onto this, you know, because that's how we now do it. There's also a film, which is called Out and About, which is kind of basically like an LGBT historical walking tour of Cork that was produced as part of Cork being the City of Culture in 2005. And then that's been screened at lots of different events, like in Manchester at the LGBT History Festival there in 2015. It was screened in Budapest, and at the kind of Out in the Past History Festival in Cork. There's also a book, The Queer Republic of Cork. And again, that was really exciting to be able to pull together some material from the archive and to tell the story of the development of the community. And it's become a kind of resource book for a lot of community organizations and for, you know, members of the community who want to have some kind of idea about the history of the community. And then, I suppose it's as well as kind of the LGBT community having access to that knowledge around the history of the LGBT community, it was important for me to also have the wider Cork community be more aware. So it was great to have coverage of the kind of various events in the kind of local Cork newspapers. And then I wrote a short play called Leeside Lezies. The Lee is the river that runs through Cork, so Leeside Lezies. And it was performed by the Link Drama Group, which is the Cork Lesbian Centre drama group. And they performed it in a theatre in Cork as part of a wider piece, but then also it was performed as the opening of the Out in the Past LGBT History Festival in Cork. I said earlier about kind of trying to create the digital archive using a kind of low-cost, low-tech model. So one of the things that I've tried to do is to share that kind of model with other people who've been wanting to set up digital archives, community digital archives. So I went to Budapest a few years ago to do training with Labrador and Hatter, the lesbian and the LGBT organisations there. Also with Frameworks Films, which is a local Cork community film company who actually produced the Out and About film. And then also I did training with current Cork LGBT organisations to try and show them how to add their own material into the digital archive, because one of the things I'd love to see is that we're capturing our history as we're making it, rather than poking around in some damp basement or closet or attic or wherever trying to find it again. So I'm trying to train people in to do that. And we had the first training session last year, and there was meant to be follow-ups, but we had a pandemic. And then I'm currently delivering training to the Northern Irish LGBT Heritage Project for them establishing their digital archive. So that's been great in terms of that North-South collaboration. And then in 2019, I led a walking tour as part of Cork Pride, and it was fabulous. It was like the Pied Piper, you know, leading this kind of band of around kind of 70 people around the city and stopping at various places which were of significance to the development of the community. So then we kind of talked about trying to do that again in 2020, but again, there was the pandemic. So we needed to kind of reimagine how we could do that. And I had often thought about the idea of putting plaques on buildings around the city so that people could realize that they were standing outside a building that had had huge significance. And then again, collaborating with Cork Pride, the idea was to actually also put QR codes on these plaques so that they linked to exhibits on the digital archive. So, you know, when we're out of this pandemic, I want you to all like come and visit Cork, and you can download the map of the Cork LGBT Archive website and take a tour, and then you scan in the QR codes and you will lead you to exhibits, which will have a mix of things from the posters to videos to this animated interviews that somebody has, or illustrated interviews that somebody did. Okay, so one of the kind of key challenges, I think, you know, with this project is the fact that there is no core funding. All the work in developing the Cork LGBT Archive is done on a voluntary basis, primarily just by me. So there's been one or two people who've come in, you know, over the years kind of to do a specific piece of work. But for the most part, it is done by one person on an unfunded basis. And I think, you know, that's great in the sense that these are passion projects. You know, we do these out of madness and passion, and because it's so important to those of us who do this work that this work is done and our histories are being preserved and shared. But I think that it does pose challenges in terms of long-term sustainability for the project. So, you know, I have got funding from the Heritage Council and the Cork City Heritage Office, but it's been for specific things. So the first piece of funding was for acid-free boxes, and then to produce the banners and then the book. And then this year, last year, to buy a scanner and audiovisual material equipment so that we can do more oral histories. And that is like, you know, really significant. I remember the first time we got the first piece of funding from the Heritage Council, it felt so symbolic because it felt like they were saying, yes, we're acknowledging that LGBT history is an important part of Irish heritage. And even if it was just funding to buy some boxes, I was incredibly excited about it and was sharing photographs of grey boxes all over social media like a mad woman. And then I suppose it's kind of been nice to have some of that work kind of acknowledged as well. Like I said, the Heritage Council Hidden History Award, and then the DRI Community Archive Scheme. And then last year, just before we locked down, we all gathered for the galas, which is the LGBT kind of award ceremony in Ireland. And it was the last time I think we were all out and about. So I just want to kind of just have a nod quickly to the kind of importance for me of feeling part of this international community, of LGBT archives and queer historians. Because when I started doing this work in Ireland, there were very few people doing anything around this in the Irish context. And I really needed to look internationally to find my community, and, you know, meeting people like Alan at various events in London, and going to New York to engage with archives there and see how they did it. But I think particularly important for me were the LGBT Arms conferences that brought together such a diverse international community of people who are creating LGBT archives in all kinds of situations, ranging from people who had huge institutional and national support and staff to people who were doing it on a shoestring like myself. And I think the opening of the Arms conference in Berlin, it was, you know, we are family and this is our family reunion. And I think that that was actually really apt to how it felt for us all gathering there again. And I would also kind of locate what I'm doing within the whole area of kind of community archives and archival activism, and a nod to Andrew Flynn, who I think is here tonight. And, you know, your work has been really, really important for me in terms of understanding what it is I was doing. Because when I started this, I was like, is it a history project? Is it an anthropological project? Is it like an archival project? What is it? And I suppose it was coming to realize that actually it's activism, and it's queer archival activism. So, you know, that's what I call myself now. I'm a queer archival activist. I'm not a trained archivist, but I dare to archive. And I think it is around those of us who don't see ourselves reflected in the archives, having to create our own archives to make sure that our history and our voices are being preserved and being heard. And this is my theme song. Because I think, you know, it's important to realize and to remember that what we're doing is fundamentally political, that it is fundamentally activism. And I suppose there's loads of work still to be done. There is so much work still to be done. A fraction of the collection has been digitized. There's a lot of oral histories to gather. But I think that the work that has been done so far with this queer archival activism has brought this rich history out of the basement and in from the margins, and being acknowledged as being an important part of Irish history and Irish heritage, and being brought into the Cork Public Museum and into the Digital Repository of Ireland. But as I said, I think there are some challenges in terms of long-term sustainability. That's my alarm telling me that I'm running out of time. But I do think, that is the key thing, is just in terms of that lack of core funding and the dependence on one volunteer for this to happen. So I'm going to finish up by just flicking through some of the images from the archive, and then I will stop talking. Okay, so thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Olga. Round of applause. That was a really inspiring and amazing talk. I think I could probably sit and listen. Well, I could listen to all of you for hours anyway, but have we got any questions for Ola or comments?
We have got a few questions, actually. Yes, let me just roll back. You've got a very nice supportive message from Andrew Flynn saying you're doing great work. So that might be...
Thank you very much.
We all... And then there's a question, sorry, I'm just running back a little way, from Dr. Clifford Williams, who has asked, can you explain why Cork became such an active place for gay rights and advancement years before other parts of Ireland? Any thoughts?
We're fabulous. Okay, most of you probably don't know a lot about Irish politics, but like Cork sees itself as the real capital of Ireland. But an awful lot of the first of LGBT activism happened in Cork, so things like that first National Gay Conference, or the first AIDS leaflet was produced in Cork, the first Lesbian Gay Film Festival, and the first LGBT float on the Patrick's Day Parade. All these things happened in Cork. And I think there was just a real sense of activism in the community. But so the first gay centre opened in Cork in 1976. And then I think the 80s, I think, were a particularly vibrant time, because you had a lot of kind of new LGBT organisations set up, which would have seen themselves as being much more radical. Some of the earlier organisations would have been seen as quite reformist, just change the law and that's it. Whereas a lot of the ones like the Cork Gay Collective that set up in 1980 would have really, they had a manifesto, and they would have seen themselves as being a much more radical queer group, and would have located the whole struggle around LGBT rights as being so linked to like feminism and the women's struggle, and the need for changing all the kind of legislation and ethos that we had around controlling people's gender expression and sexuality. So, and then we had the Key Co-op opening in the 1980s and Loafers Bar, and both those locations provided spaces for people to gather and to organize and for so many things to happen, so I think that all those things combined, but you have to remember as well, like in the 1970s and 80s and right up to the 90s in Ireland, homosexuality was criminalized, and there was no kind of protection of the law. So there was a lot of allies coming into play as well, and I think particularly the trade unions, in terms of supporting kind of like campaigns to change the law. But I think fundamentally it comes down to the fact that we had decades and decades of very brave activists who refused to accept the dominant narrative that we were sinners and criminals and perverts, and demanded that we be treated with respect and equality, and set about fundamentally changing the world in which lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgender people existed and lived in Cork.
Great, thank you. I suppose privilege. I have a very brief question. Well, two things. I have a comment and a question. First of all, the comment is, I do, obviously we met quite a long time ago, and I remember hearing you talking about all this, and I remember thinking you're a bit of a hero of mine. It's like, actually, could I match this lady's energy and commitment, and I haven't, but you continue to inspire me. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
It's a lot to have you here tonight and talking. And then on a more serious archival note, you were saying about the collections moved into a sort of more permanent home, and that they're doing the cataloguing for you. I was just interested, who's doing the cataloguing, and are they comfortable with that? Because I know when we deposited the Pride in Our Past collection, there was a little bit of trepidation from our local record office about, oh, we're not quite sure of language, and we're not quite sure. And I wondered if that's something you've had a discussion about, or whether they were...
I mean, I found it really scary, the whole idea of giving the collection to something like the Public Museum. And I was conscious as well, there's an Irish queer archive that was donated to the National Library of Ireland. And there were and there still are a lot of difficulties in terms of people being able to access that collection. And even people who had donated their own stuff having difficulty kind of getting access to it. So we were quite kind of nervous about it, but it literally came to a point where I'd had access to a room in the university here, and was told I needed to get out now, and it needed to go somewhere, and it needed to go somewhere safe. But a lot of time they're working on the work that we'd already done. So, I'd already kind of like sorted things into kind of categories, and they're working with that framework, but they're very open to the fact that we have the expertise, not them. So if there's stuff they're not sure of, they'll talk to us about it. And I think it came in part of a move within that museum to expand their own concept of what Cork culture and heritage is. So they have created a permanent Cork Traveller exhibition. So the Travelling Community is the largest Indigenous ethnic minority group in Ireland. So there's a traveller exhibition now in the museum, and they also created a Jewish exhibition where they use some of the physical bits of the synagogue that closed down as part of the exhibition. And they see the kind of LGBT exhibition kind of fitting into that thing of trying to expand what they're doing. And the curator also said that, you know, the marriage equality referendum helped. It made it easier for people like him to do this kind of work than it would have done when things were more illegal. So, you know, we'll see. It's a work in progress. And the problem is there's no funding for somebody to work on this specifically, though. So they often just have like their volunteers in kind of working on it. So it's taken a lot longer than we had planned.
Yeah. But that ongoing conversation is probably really useful, isn't it? So yeah.
It is. And you know, one of the clauses we put in for donating it to them was that even while this work was continuing, that I have a right of access to the material all the time, and that I can digitize anything I want to. So that was a really important thing, that it wasn't that we gave it to them and lost it, because I talked to another archive and they said, yeah, we'll take it, and you lose it for 7 years. You don't get to see it again, because it'll take us that long to sort it, and you don't get any engagement with it in that time. So with the public museum, they're perfectly willing to have me physically come in and root around and do whatever I want to do with it.
Brilliant. No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, hang on. Sorry, just.
Yeah, it's a question from Andrew. Hi, Orla. Can you tell us something more about adding your material to Europeia? No, I think it might be quite a complicated process. Is it something more community-based archives should try to do? Do you get much response from people looking at your histories there? This might be something for CAHG to try and encourage more widely.
So the DRI, the Digital Repository of Ireland, is one of the organisations that is able to link collections to Europeana. So the process of the Cork LGBT Archive collection being added to Europeana went through the DRI. So they facilitated that. And you know, some of the collection was added to the DRI as it was at that point. There's been much more added, so we now need to kind of update the collections as well. But I think that the more queer material that's added to the Europeana, the better, because they didn't have a lot before my collection was added. And then when mine was added, they actually created an LGBT kind of theme or exhibition, kind of bringing together a number of bits of material that they had, but they said up to that point they didn't have enough. So I think there's definitely an openness there to add more. And again, in terms of just that greater visibility. But I don't know in the UK context who are your national kind of aggregators from the UK to Europeana. So you can maybe, I can give you a contact in Europeana of the people that have been dealing with there as well. And one of the things they asked me to do then after the collection was added to Europeana was to do a guest blog there as well. So again, it's all about increasing that visibility, because, you know, a lot of the stuff in Europeana is more kind of mainstream. So it's all about queering it up, isn't it? You know, so it would be great to see more of the UK collections added in as well.
Well, welcome back, everybody. What a fantastic first half. Thank you again to both first speakers, Dan and Orla. Inspiring, amazing. Well, my list of where I'm going to visit when we finally get let out of COVID is growing ever longer. And so we get on to our third speaker of the evening, and it is our very own Mr. Alan Butler. He's here tonight to talk to us about the Plymouth LGBT Archive and his exciting new HLF-funded project, the Rainbow Connections. I hand straight over to you, because I'm sure you're going to explain it all for us.
Thank you very much. So note to self, when you program something, don't put Orla on before you, because you're going to look bad. It'll all pick up after me. The other note to self, just out of interest, everyone who's speaking, I've said, oh, come early and test your slides and everything. And it was only partway through the first half I realized I haven't tested mine. So fingers crossed. You know, let's just see. There we go. Can anybody see that? Yeah, good, good. So yes, so I'm, let me see if I can just get that going. There we go. Hopefully that looks like a slideshow. I'm Alan Butler, check time, and I'm here to talk about the Plymouth LGBT archive, a little bit of history around an archive, which seems appropriate, and then something we've been developing called the Rainbow Connection, which I find terribly interesting, and I hope other people will as well. So we'll see how we get on. So if I just do that. There we go. Hopefully that's moved. So people who know me will have heard me talk about pride in our past. Now, very, very briefly, in 2011, the LGBT community of Plymouth was approached by our local museum, which is now the Box, and it provoked a conversation about there not being a great deal of positive material in there around LGBT plus lives. Now, at the time, that seemed quite a reasonable thing, whereas now, you know, we're sort of moving on rapidly. So what we have here is our attempt to kind of represent changing that. And I don't know if you can read it. It says, let's put some color into the archive. And we photoshopped some books and some boxes pink, which, you know, nearly 10 years ago seemed really clever and interesting, and now is a little bit cringy, but, you know, we stand by it. We stand by it. So the idea was, how can we actually represent Plymouth's LGBT heritage within our archives? Now, Plymouth, I am a Plymouthian, you'll be shocked to hear based on my accent, but Plymouth has always been a place that's a little bit quiet about a number of things, and things go somewhat unspoken. So you know, LGBT lives were very similar to that. People kind of kept lives, you know, a little on the down low, shall we say. We were never a very sort of out and proud community through the, you know, the 50s and the 60s, when possibly we should have been. So it was very difficult to look at how we were going to do that. But at the same time, the organisations that existed in the city, we knew that we had an older group of people who'd seen sort of a massive shift, and it was like, how can we capture those lives, and how can we archive them? So we started talking to the museum around this. We started talking to our membership around this and how we would do it, and we did the very bold thing of putting in a heritage lottery bid, as they were called back. And they gave us a chunk of money to actually undertake a project. And this was the criteria that we were awarded the money under. So to create a permanent, static, virtual archive of LGBT life within the city of Plymouth, to recruit and train members of the LGBT community to act as oral historians. I kind of resent act as oral historians now, but, you know, I think that was the terminology at the time. To record and compile the memories of older members of the community for their community, to research the history of LGBT life within the city, to hold an exhibition. And that was actually something that added quite a lot of weight to our cause, was that the museum actually offered us at that point a 9-week exhibition of basically whatever we found over the next 12 months. Which was quite a bold offer for a museum to make nearly 10 years ago. So that added a lot of weight to us actually doing it. And then, if I'm being really honest, I was advised that it was a very good idea to promote intergenerational learning to the bid, because the Heritage Lottery Fund like intergenerational learning. And if I'm being really honest, at that moment in time, it was like, well, do you know what? We're working with a youth group, we're working with older people. We can do something intergenerational, I'm sure. And that was the extent of the thinking at that point. What's really interesting, and that's the point of the Rainbow Connection, I think, is that actually that intergenerational learning has really become the crux of everything we do. So, you know, what's the expression? Careful what you wish for in life, really.
I'm going to call this person.
Oh, somebody's still got there.
So they responded and said they had an appointment.
Let me just
physical therapy.
Seeing if I can see.
She said that she can do it by email, but it's probably better
And
to
talking, but I don't know.
To tell them that they need to mute.
you have to send your date of birth and your CAHG ID.
Can we kindly ask if everyone's got everything on mute?
Sounds like it. Sorry, it's tricky for me to find that while I've got the slides running. Lovely. That sounds like it's gone quiet. Right. Now I just. There we go. So we began looking at this project, and the first thing that occurred to us in creating an LGBT archive, and I wonder if other people have found this, is that there's not a whole lot of archival material. So, you know, if you think about what goes into an archive, it's letters, it's photos, it's diaries. If you're part of the LGBT community, or certainly if you were part of the LGBT community in Plymouth in the sort of last 40, 50 years, people didn't create a lot of this sort of material. I was interviewing the gentleman here, Ted Whitehead, and talking about this, and he said, oh, I've got a photo upstairs with a sailor sat on my lap in one of the gay bars from the 50s. Would you like it? And I said, I would very much like that, Ted. Thank you very much. And he went and fetched it. But very rare to find this kind of thing. So when you're trying to create an archive, you struggle to find that particular material. Now, I'm very much of the opinion, having worked as an oral historian for quite some time doing this, that actually LGBT lives tend to be more performative, shall we say, and lived in the moment. Now, that usually upsets quite a number of people with the assumption that performative must mean that they're not authentic. Do you know what I mean? No, I'm not performing it. I am LGBT. Well, we are indeed. That's very true. But actually, there's that moment of, you know, acting in a particular way, displaying a certain aspect of who you are because you're in the right space and you're in the right time and you're with the right people. And then in other situations, in other circumstances, perhaps you performed a bit differently. And certainly in Plymouth, when I talk to people about the LGBT past and pride in their past, they would take a great deal of pride in the fact that, well, actually, for most of the time, I went unnoticed. You know, I passed most of the time, but in certain situations, in certain scenarios, I could display who I actually am. And that's fine, but it makes it very difficult to create an archive, which leads us, I mean, this is the exhibition that we put on. So this is an aspect of pride in our past. Now, if I'm being really truthful, we found some t-shirts, we found some badges, but if you look there, a lot of our panels have audio pens attached so that you could hear people talking about their lives as opposed to showing them something. And this particular case here, literally a couple of days before the exhibition opened, I found myself in HMV buying sort of Queer as Folks box set and Brokeback Mountain and all sorts of tenuous links, really, just to create some sort of artifacts that people could look at in a case, because it wasn't really what our exhibition was about. And what our exhibition was about instead was far more the language and capturing people's stories. Now, if you're trying to create the sense of a community by capturing their stories, the first problem you run into is language. And what I've got going on here is a kind of alphabet soup situation. You know, we've extended the language massively to encompass a whole load of identities and a whole load of people and a whole load of ways of being. So when we talk about LGBT plus, you know, this particular definition, LGBTQQIAAP, it's quite extensive now, but it needs to be this expensive to, you know, encompass all the different people that we're dealing with. I personally very much like queer as an umbrella term, but some people are rather uncomfortable with that. It harkens back to other times for them. So that's a little bit difficult, but we're trying to include everybody, and we're trying to create a community out of a group of people who are actually very diverse and very different, but we're banding together in our otherness, for want of a better expression. So there are all these words, all these identities we're trying to include. And now, you know, that's before we move on to people who are non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer. We need more and more words, or possibly we need less words, and we just need to be talking about people, but we're not quite at that point yet. So here we are trying to create an archive of people's lives when it's quite a disparate group of people. The other story that tends to come up when you are trying to capture people's LGBT existence is this idea of coming out. And people tend to assume that coming out is a once in a lifetime moment. You know, we even do it to each other. We talk to each other and say, are you out? You know, I'm out. You out. But it's, you know, we do it all the time. Every new scenario, every new person you meet, do you come out to them? Do you not come out to them? If you don't come out to them, then are you withholding something? Are you keeping a secret? And how do we create this sense of identity? Now, with Plymouth, when I began, and I imagine it's very much what all have found, when I began this project, people were kind of like, you're in the wrong place to be doing this kind of work, because we don't have an LGBT community, because people weren't signifying themselves in that way, they weren't talking about themselves in that way, so there wasn't that sense of community. So what we were trying to do with this archive was capture a group of people's heritage, but actually bring them together as a group of people. And that's where the oral history process came in. So, okay, we haven't got the artifacts and we haven't got, you know, a wide range of letters and diaries, but actually we can sit people down and we can talk to them and we can create a space where they actually discuss who they are and how they are. And actually, for me, in that oral history process, you're almost going back to the performative again, because what you're doing is creating a space for someone to re-perform this moment of these moments in their lives. So yes, they have lived queer lives in spaces that they felt safe to do so. And actually what we're doing with the oral history interview is creating another space for them to re-perform that life for you, for them to actually hand you an aspect of their past that you can then archive by recording it, transcribing it, videoing it, whatever you decide to do with it, but it becomes something that you can actually include in the history books. And that's incredibly important. And it's become so much so that the Oral History Society, who are the, you know, the sort of great supporters of oral history work, in recent years, they've begun to look at what they call special interest groups. And they very deliberately put together an LGBTQ group who actually now have a membership of over 100 people, and actually is the sort of most active oral history group they've got, because it's absolutely intrinsic, I think, to the work we do, and trying to sort of archive our lives and talk to each other in a way that makes sense to each other about being connected and being a community, that we have this sense of heritage. So in terms of oral history work, that space is becoming incredibly important, I think, for us to sort of connect in that way. So to go back to Plymouth, before I get onto the Rainbow Connection, I'm talking about the fact that a lot of people are uncomfortable with the term queer. This, if you'd have Googled gay or LGBT Plymouth up until about 10 years ago, this is the imagery you would have got. And it's based, it happened around a murder that took place in our Central Park in 1995, where two men were attacked by a group of youths. One was killed almost outright and the other was left with life-changing injuries for the rest of his life. Now, you know, for Plymouth, this was almost our outing, really. You had this very quiet community that had not drawn attention to themselves. When a lot of the oral history interviews I've done, people talk about, oh, you know, nobody really knew because I didn't make a fuss and I didn't draw attention. And people had very deliberately tried not to do that. And then suddenly we're outed in this very sort of graphic, angry manner. And a community that's tried to keep its head down is suddenly thrust into, you know, literally the national press. So I think this is where we are. When we began looking at creating this archive and creating this sense of community, this was kind of our starting point in Plymouth, which really wasn't the best starting point to begin with. But at the same time, you can't whitewash history. You have to acknowledge where we are. And, you know, people have talked to me about this incident and kind of said, oh, you know, didn't realize, you know, until then that people hated us. And as a younger man myself, you know, I remember being in my sort of mid-20s and thinking, this isn't a place I can come out. This isn't a place I can be myself. And it took me quite a number of years to come round to a different kind of approach to that. So this was Plymouth's first Pride March, which took place about 10 years afterwards. And with no disrespect to it, was incredibly short. It literally went about 300 yards from one side of a road to another, carrying a big rainbow flag. Moscow had a pride parade the same year, and people were shooting at them, and they still went further than we did in Plymouth. So that's no criticism of Plymouth. It's just kind of giving you a sense of where we were in terms of pride. And people felt that this kind of show didn't really, you know, back to the performity again, people didn't feel that this type of performance matched their experience, although that's slowly changing since we've spent more time talking about our history. And this kind of leaves us with the archive, with this kind of intangible, ephemeral history that we need to acknowledge and capture and share, but it's not there in a physical sense. I actually do a kind of, much as I always say, I do an LGBT heritage tour around the city of Plymouth. And it's quite bizarre because I spend quite a lot of time taking people to places that aren't there anymore to tell them how significant it was. And again, in good old-fashioned oral history tradition, where I can, I will either play a recording of somebody talking about how important this place was, or better still, get them along to stand there and actually tell that bit of their story as well. So that's something that goes on. And in the process of that, we kind of recreate it. So this is me taking a group of unsuspecting people on the tour, and you'll notice a lot of them are carrying small rainbow flags. So I get them to recreate that small pride parade and wave their flags and walk over the road and do it. And it's really interesting how many people feel able to do that, feel able to be part of that space. Because I've had people go, well, I can't wave that flag because it doesn't represent my identity. And it's like, well, you can still wave a flag for us, you know. So that conversation again about who's in this community, who's out of this community, and how we create that sense of being a community whilst also listening to the wider sort of geographical community is just constantly being tested and examined with all the work that we do with this. So that brings me on to the Rainbow Connection. So this is Kermit the Frog. And Kermit the Frog sang a song called The Rainbow Connection. Now, the idea with the Rainbow Connection, I said to you earlier that, I rather crassly threw in intergenerational work into the aims of the original project. What came to light, and it's totally obvious, is that young LGBTQ plus people, young queer people, tend to pop up in families that aren't queer. And there are all sorts of exceptions to that, and there are all sorts of families and all sorts of diversities, but as a rule, most young people are born to, heterosexual, cisgender people, because that's where most children are born. So, with other ethnicities, with other cultures, with other religions, very often mum and dad's experience will match on to children's experience, nan and granddad's experience will match onto that. There is a sort of lineage in terms of storytelling and histories. With LGBT people, we just pop up where we're least expected. And because of that, we might have fantastic, empathetic, supportive, amazing parents, but they're never actually going to go, it was just like that for me. I went through that, because it's not really their experience. And that is the basis of the Rainbow Connection, basically. With the Rainbow Connection in Plymouth, we have spent the best part of 10 years convincing a very quiet older generation that they should be talking about how fantastic their lives were and how bold they've been and how they've challenged things. So we have that on one hand. We have a younger generation who, with the best will in the world, are feeling that they need to kind of reinvent the wheel somewhat, because they've popped up in these families. They're not quite sure where to go. So, they're following YouTubers and they're in Facebook groups, and that's all amazing. But actually, there's something really nice about just introducing them to somebody else. So the Rainbow Connection is taking that older generation and introducing them to the younger generation and saying, do you know what? You've both got stories that the other would probably like to hear and would find really interesting and beneficial. So in that sense, we're kind of creating, as I've got in the quote here, you know, we're reconciling a sense of difference. We're connecting to elders in our community that we haven't really seen as a community. And we're creating a sense of legacy, because with the best will in the world, if something is old and if something is in history, it's seen to have a little bit more value. If something's endured, it's seen to be more important. And actually, as young LGBT people, we don't always get that sense. So we want to kind of create that. The group that I hadn't really thought about was the group in the middle. So very often the parents and things who possibly, you know, Section 28 came into force in 1988 and effectively stopped schools and local authorities from talking about LGBT lives, and for a, you know, vast number of years. And even today, I mean, it's long gone, but you can still go into schools. I was in a school quite recently and there was a really long conversation about, you know, is it okay for a teacher to be out? And the kids were thinking, actually, are any of our teachers out? And do, you know, it's still something that people aren't entirely sure about. So we've managed to create a generation who possibly haven't had these discussions very much. And some of those people are now parents of young queer people and just don't have the information to pass on a legacy to them. But because of the situation we've reached in society, they're now feeling that they should know better and they shouldn't be questioning and they shouldn't be saying, oh, actually, could someone help me out with this, you know, even though it's not their experience. So the Rainbow Connection is about kind of bringing all that together in a really holistic way, in a really useful way, hopefully. And at the moment, it's very based in Plymouth because we know our ground in Plymouth, but we're hoping it might expand out further. So currently, we're working with Bernardo's. And Bernardo's do a lot of work, obviously, in terms of mentoring. With young looked after people, they will be, you know, their social worker might change, their foster parents might change, but they will drop somebody into somebody's life as what they call an independent visitor, who will just maintain some contact with that young person, meet them for a coffee once a month or something like that, and just kind of keep a connection. So what we're doing is we're using exactly that model with the older people from our archive to connect with the younger people in our archive. And actually what that means is that our archive isn't just a pink box on a shelf anymore, but it's actual real people interacting with each other and actually passing on a kind of legacy. We do a lot of work in schools, and as you can see, I'm always very careful to maintain my dignity at all times. So this is me with the rainbow umbrella, and that's a very, very game teacher who joined in greatly with this. But again, it's just creating that space again. It's a safe space. So the classroom in that moment becomes a safe space, and it becomes a space for language. For young people and older people to ask the questions that maybe they don't feel they can ask anymore. One of these sessions, one young lady asked me if I'd ever tried being normal. And you could see the teacher kind of go, oh my God, you know, but actually I really relished that, because then we got to have a really nice conversation about what's normal and what's not, and, you know, created a space to move things along a little bit. How am I doing? Another, nearly at the end, another aspect is Plymouth being a dispersal city. So as a dispersal city, a number of asylum seekers come to Plymouth seeking asylum. They're sort of dropped into Plymouth, and what we're finding is a large number of them are here because they're LGBT. They've fled persecution in countries that they've come from. So here they are in Plymouth, and they're trying to, talk about why they're here and why they need asylum and what they're escaping, and two, they're looking to become, you know, part of the community. Now, we've already established that our queer community is very diverse and very complicated, and lots of people and lots of identities. So actually, the first thing we want to do is bring this group of people into it as well. But we're back to language then. They're trying to talk about being different, firstly, very often in a second language, which is difficult. But even, you know, even when they're learning English and they're good with English, words for who they are don't actually exist in their language, or if they do exist, they're associated with shame. So we've been able to do an awful lot of work with people to get them to talk about who they are, to become part of the community that we have here in Plymouth. And talking about archives as activism, we've even been able to use those conversations and those oral history processes to then go and give evidence for people as part of their asylum case and help them prove that they're LGBT. I mean, it's crazy that we live in a world where you have to prove that you're LGBT, but that's where we are, and this gives us a means to do it. And again, another aspect of the Rainbow Connection. And I'll end, because I think I'm going to, just with Ted and Don. So Ted is the gentleman, the chap with the scarf here is a gentleman who had a sailor on his lap in one of the other photos. This is a picture of him marrying his partner Don for the first time in the 80s. It wasn't actually a marriage because we weren't allowed to get married back then, but actually Section 28 and everything, a lot of people in Plymouth just thought, do you know what, we're doing it and we don't care whether it counts legally or not. So they were married at that stage when this painting was painted. They married each other again in the 90s when civil partnerships came in. And actually, if Ted had survived long enough, they would have married each other again in light of same-sex marriage. So, you know, this is an amazing generation of people who've reinscribed their lives time and time again to keep up with changes in law and legislation and attitudes. And I think it's really important that we capture how amazing they've been so that we can hand it down to the next generation. And hopefully they won't have to be quite as amazing, but they will be, but without the challenges. And that's really the Rainbow Connection. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Alan. Amazing, inspiring again. I mean, I'm biased. I'm lucky I get to work on the Pride in Plymouth LGBT archive, so I do have some inside knowledge of it, but amazing. So do we have any questions or comments from anyone? Victoria said this was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
There's lots of fascinating and we're all elders to somebody. That's a horrible thought, isn't it?
I consider myself an elder now.
Is anybody putting their hands up? Sorry,
Can
just
I ask a quick question?
yeah.
How have you found schools? Have they been quite hungry for you to come in, quite keen?
They have, bizarrely. Sorry, just stop sharing. They have. I've been at a couple of conferences. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and this lady came up to me and she said, "So, do you do gay then?" And I said, "That is one way of putting it. Yes, yes, I do." And she said, "Oh, good, because I've had someone in to do race, and I've had someone in to do," and they're really. There is a sort of strange appetite for somebody to come in and talk about this, but I think there's still a little bit of a fear that people will come in and they think people are going to come in and start talking about a kind of sex education lesson. So when you talk about, actually, I can tell you about this community of people and things, then you kind of, yeah, you get a bit of a free pass to come in and have that conversation, and it's quite exciting, actually.
Excellent. Anywhere else? Right. If that's the case, then she slightly overran.
Said I sorry.
We'll move on to our fourth and final speakers of the evening. We'd like to invite Dom and Jamie from Our Story in Scotland. They're going to tell the story about the collection, recording and preserving of the life stories and experience of people across the border in the community of Scotland. So welcome, Dom and Jamie.
Hello. We are going to incorporate intergenerationality into our presentation, as you will already have seen. And we have the advantage that we're building on wonderful speakers who've already spoken today, so we can refer back to what they've done. One of the things that impresses me particularly is the commonality of what we're doing, is that we share a great deal in common with what has been said already. To go back to what Orla said, we have a passion project. I love this word. I don't know where you got it from, Orla. If it's original, you have to coin it. But definitely, it's a passion project. We have, from the beginning, been staffed wholly by volunteers. We have no paid staff. We're all dedicated, and I mean dedicated, to collecting, archiving, and presenting the stories of the LGBTQ+ community in Scotland. And those features of our work, collecting, archiving, and presenting, are all crucial, and they're all intertwined, as you'll see when I take you through 20 years of our history. So we have 20 years in 20 minutes, which is quite difficult. But anyway, you can write the history of the world in about 2 sentences if you want to. I don't know where COVID's going to appear there. So in terms of what we have done, I want to emphasize some of the principles that have guided us from the beginning. So at various points, I'll be flagging those up. So if you are thinking of setting up a community archive yourself, then you will recognize that these ones are ones which you might want to think about. Whereas Orla and Alan will say that they've already thought about this, and they have, because I've been witnessing how those principles have come through your work already. So I'd like you to imagine sitting 20 years ago in the now defunct LGBT Centre in Glasgow, in a meeting of diverse artists, a wonderful name, diverse artists. And we're sitting around and we're a bit amazed at what has happened in Scotland over the last 20 years, because I can tell you 20 years prior to that, in fact, 40 years to this day, we had the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in Scotland. And that was 14 years after it had happened in England and Wales. By 2001, we'd actually leapfrogged ahead, and we felt we were more progressive than other parts of the UK. We had abolished Section 28 as one of the first moves in the new Scottish Parliament, which also gave us confidence. It was celebrating diversity, and it was no chance that Diverse Artists was actually the name of the organization that we were there in. So we thought, how can we actually express this? How can we record that people had been involved in all these terrific changes, particularly the older generation that had seen these changes occurring? And I asked a simple question to the group: is anybody archiving this? Is there anybody in Scotland who's doing this work? Nobody knew of it. And so they said, well, go and find out. So I went and found out. And in fact, there was nobody doing this on a national level. There wasn't very much going on a local level. There were new organizations set up, Rainbow City in Edinburgh, at about the same time that we did, with the similar idea. So we thought, well, we're going to have huge ambition. We'll go Scotland wide. We'll do the lot. We'll include the whole of Scotland. And we took advice. We took advice from the Oral History Society, wonderful advice from them, which has guided us throughout. And we thought, we've got to have an opening event. So within a year of starting, we had, well, what do you think we did? Do you think we started collecting or archiving? No, we started actually, in a sense, putting the cart before the horse. We started with an exhibition before we had any materials to exhibit. So we collected the exhibition materials. This in itself was part of the collecting. We had an idea of what we were going to do. We were going to call it Becoming Visible, which was part of the whole aim. And what we'd seen over the previous 20 years was people becoming more and more visible despite Section 28. And we decided we would have this wonderful interaction between the collecting and the archiving and the presenting. And so this is perhaps what I would say is the first principle. See those three things as part of the same thing. They're intertwined. They interplay with each other. It's not a vicious circle, it's a virtuous circle, where you will find that if you take the things you've collected and you present them, you archive them, but you take them out of the archive, you present them in exhibitions to people, or you present them in a live event, in a storytelling event, or a CAHG as we've done, and you will find that this actually gets more stories that come back, more stories that are collected, more stories that can go into the archive. So how do we get them into an archive? Well, the other thing that haunted us, and I love that picture that you had, Orla, of Arthur's room, like a kind of attic room, absolutely full of stuff, which is precious, but you don't know what to do with it. We were really haunted by that idea that it was going to end up, what we collected would end up in attics or cupboards. And we'd seen some organizations that had set up, such as the Brighton Our Story Project we took our name, our story from them. But we were worried because they had all their materials in a rented building. It was not in a public archive. And more recently, we heard that a lot of that ended up in a skip. So if you are thinking of setting up an archive, try to get a public archive, a secure public archive, which is also accessible. That notion of access is also vital. So when you negotiate with national institutions or local libraries, local museums, try to make sure that you're going to have access along the way as well. So I took that on by talking to lots of people in different libraries and museums throughout Scotland. And at first I got, well, it's not the right time, or this is not the right place, or we don't have any staff who can do it. Okay, we've got volunteers who can help. Yes, but. And then finally somebody said, I know a wonderful woman called Dorothy Kidd who works for the National Museum Scotland. And they introduced us to her, and she responded when I said, do you think you could take this on? She simply said yes. And I thought I must have misheard, so I had to get her to repeat it. It was too good news to be true, but it was true. She took our materials. She decided she would take the episodes from people's lives, that we got people to do handwritten episodes from their lives, a significant episode of their life that would go into the National Museums of Scotland. We've got hundreds there. They are accessible. People can go along and find them. We're trying to get them put online as well. That's a longer process, but they're certainly accessible if you go along there. She also took artworks that we developed as part of visual storytelling. And when we got back to one of the key things that was part of what we really wanted to do, which was capturing people's stories in audio recordings, she also was willing to take that, but we found that in terms of digitization, the National Library of Scotland was going to be the more appropriate place for that. So we have what is called a dispersed archive. It's an archive that is there at National Museum Scotland, at the National Library of Scotland, and we also have some materials, including the records of our own organization, at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. That can cause problems in the sense of people not knowing where things are. And so we suggested to the National Library of Scotland that they have a guide that can be constantly updated of where researchers can go if they're looking for LGBTQ+ materials and they're doing research in Scotland. And the National Library have that. If you look up Guide to LGBT Research Materials in Scotland, you'll find it on the National Library of Scotland webpage. Just Google that and you'll come up with it. And it's a constantly updated thing which shows the different places where you can find the materials. So we've got our second main principle, a secure public archive. So how do we get the materials for putting in there? Well, one of the ways we did that was through a fantastic project that was funded. We've had funding, as Orla did, at particular times for particular projects or particular equipment or whatever. And we had funding from what was then called the Scottish Arts Council, now called Creative Scotland, for going throughout Scotland to collect queer stories. And we found as we did this that we developed new ways of collecting stories. They included working with Dundee Contemporary Arts in a collaborative project where they were helping us to do visual storytelling. And those materials in turn have gone on to National Museum Scotland. We also found that we could go to Aberdeen and set up a marquee, an Our Story tent, where we employed an actor to act as Madam Historia to entice people into the tent and use a crystal ball to try and read their stories. It was much better getting that and getting the episodes that came through that than trying to do a recording in a public place, which was extremely noisy. But we never forgot that oral history was going to be one of the hearts of our project, as Alan also has pointed out. It's very important to get people to do their performative thing. I totally agree with that, Alan. I think there is an element of performativity about this. And we got people to tell their stories to us in full-length oral history recording. The longest one that we did was about 4 hours. Fantastic recording you can see on our YouTube channel. Just Google Our Story Scotland YouTube, look at Nick's recording. It's a particular excerpt from a recording where he went on to perform at our CAHG a 7-minute resume of his 4-minute recording. So you can tell things in a shorter or a longer way. We had to decide who was going to be recording number 1. And that was going to be difficult because with our emphasis on inclusivity, on having as many different parts of our community representative, and that's our 4th principle, with that emphasis, we didn't want to say, well, we're going to have an L or a G or a B or a T, and that's going to put all the other noses out. And so what we decided to do was have somebody who felt that they could be any of those identities. And Steph is an intersex person who gets up in the morning and to decide, today I'm going to be this gender, today I'm going to have this sexuality. And we did a recording with Steph as our recording number 1. And went on from there to do many other long recordings with people. And the longevity of our project, the fact we've been going for 20 years, means actually that we've been able to go back and record people again within a space. Say we did a recording of bisexuals in 2004, and 16 years later, Dom was involved, as he'll tell you about, in doing a recording of By Scotland, by Glasgow, as it then became all those years afterwards. And whether the situation for bisexuals had changed, I'll leave him to tell you a bit about that. One of the key things that we wanted to make sure was that we did collaboration and cooperation with other organizations. And we learned that very early on. We learned that if we wanted to do our work, we had to collaborate. It was impossible to do it on our own. We didn't want to do it on our own. We were offered more money, believe it or not, by the Scottish Arts Council. It's extremely rare to be offered more money. We were absolutely delighted until we start thinking, oh no, we're going to have to do budgeting again. So we actually said no. We said we don't want the money because it's going to lead us to wasting our life doing budgeting, and we want to get off and collect the stories. But they said, why don't you work with somebody else? So we did. We worked with the Village Storytelling Centre in Glasgow. They did the budgeting. We did all the exciting work. We went and did multimedia workshops with dance and music and collage, which we then went on to develop into exhibitions, which have been to all different parts of Scotland. So that notion of cooperation and collaboration has been central to our work. And I think I'll end by saying some of the ways in which we've done that. We've worked with theatre companies, 784 Theatre Company, in dramatising our stories. We've worked, as I've said already, with Dundee Contemporary Arts in developing visual storytelling. We've worked with LGBT Youth Scotland in developing digital storytelling for Our Vivid Stories, first exhibited at the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow. We've worked with Leap Sports Scotland at the Commonwealth Games in 2014, where we developed the first ever LGBT history walk of Glasgow. We've worked with Historic Environment Scotland, mapping significant queer places in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Ayr. And we've worked with the LGBT Centre for Health and Wellbeing in launching our Coming In project at the National Library of Scotland. And we did that in a way to celebrate those people who have come into Scotland from overseas at a time when xenophobia was particularly rising in the whole of the UK due to the EU referendum. So we've done all of that, and we've also got a whole new generation of volunteers which have joined in the meantime, one of whom, and one of the most active ones of all, is Dom, and he's going to continue with what we've been doing in more recent times.
That was lovely. Oh, I always get a lovely introduction from Jane. Lovely. I kind of intersect a lot of stories, which is interesting. I am a Section 28 baby. So all that James just listed, I never got contact with. I had to find for myself. I had to wait until I was an adult and somehow search for that. And how I did that was becoming a volunteer. Do you want to summarise oral histories? I didn't even know what an oral history interview was. Because like Orla, I'm not an academic, or I am just a community activist, and everything else comes after that. I was coming from a place of being a counsellor and a therapist and somebody that wasn't rooted in their past, wasn't rooted in their community, had that disconnection. And I used that forceful because it wasn't done, it was done to us. And there was ways that we now have to look up for that. So that always informs my work. And one of the examples is, I'm going to take you right back to last February. We're going to do a quick year in a couple of minutes. And somebody approached me, the manager of a local charity, Pink Saltire, that I now work for down here, said, we would like to do some sort of podcast series called 50 Years of Rainbow Activism. I don't like the name, but there you go. And it was to focus on all the progressive wins that we've had in Scotland and how we fought them, the activists that were involved. I didn't like this idea because I thought this was a bit too narrow and a bit too slim. So I said, no, I'll go to James and he'll back me up and say we should do full oral history interviews and then let these people tell this story. And it was funded because I had travel expenses. I got a fee. We shared copyright. So everyone that I went to knew that they would be in a podcast and they would also be archived for the next 100 years. So they got that long-term activism, they got that as well. But because everybody was over 50, like Alan said, the word queer had to be discussed. Language had to be discussed, since you were a minority group, then a homosexual, then a gay society, then an L&G society, then LGBT, and then it's still progressing, and some older people, elders, however you want to term them, saying that they now love the word queer because of that whole storytelling that they've got, that arc. Then COVID hit, basically. So I done 21 interviews in 24 days, groups, more than one group in a day, think what you will. And I ended up getting ill. I ended up catching COVID. I ended up being particularly unwell, having to go around all my people, interviewees over 50, some high risk. Are you okay? You have to do the ethical side. Everyone was fine bar me. So I am now editing this podcast at home, like a teenager in their bedroom, self-isolating. And it came at a good time. It came at a time where we didn't have prides. We couldn't come together. We couldn't share our stories. So this was a place that we've got these stories. We've got the last 50 years here ready to go edited. We were on BBC Scotland, we were on the radio. I was on Kay Adams, my father-in-law was positive I was going to be on Loose Women. It was fascinating times. But then we were in a position as well of thinking, so we will give it a couple of months and see if it passes, or we would still continue to do our work. And we were like, no, we need to do it now. There's so much going on that's impacting us. We need to get those stories. So we had Queer Distance, so people could write a diary. They could write about a day in lockdown as a non-cis het person. And then we took advice again from the Oral History Society in regards to like more focused interviews over long distance, not meeting face to face. It reminds me of the term, James, that I'm looking for, I can't think of. Somebody might.
Remote recording.
Remote recording, that's the word, that's the term.
Double-ended recording as well.
I've got 3 examples of that, and one is from the Scottish LGBTQI Police Association. They are, is it 30 or 40 years? I was arguing about this with myself earlier.
They've been getting on for 30 years.
30 years, and they're the only one left in the UK. There was an English one, there was, I'm sure, a Welsh one at one point, but they've all kind of went under. But Scotland still exists, so they were able to contact us. We were able to do a remote interview, which was much more emotional than anyone thought it was going to be, about being able to march in pride in your police uniform, and for somebody to say, like, are you just security? No, I'm out, I'm gay and a policeman. And that to be a real emotional thing. And whatever our community thinks about the police, whatever prejudice there are, rightly so or otherwise, that's a unique person's story. That story's not been captured. And that story came with videos, posters, all the ephemera that comes with these associations. And then that could be archived together in the National Library Scotland as a group. So if you go there, want to look at this association, you will have that full range there. We also got a call during lockdown from a lovely man called Jim Mairns. I'm moving house. I've got this stuff, as we see here. Can you take this stuff? And we're like, well, no, right now we cannot collect anything, but we can do an interview. We can do a remote interview if you focused on your experiences of the Section 28 campaign. And again, he gave a very emotional interview about being in a very masculine, tough trade union environment. And after 2000, at the end of that long slog, it just got to him, and he burst into tears during this big trade union event, just when the floodgates open and that finally get that release, his work had been completed, he'd succeeded, and talking to somebody like myself who was younger, who was schooled during that time, there was a lot between us. We were both changed by that process. Like Alan said, going into schools is something that we've done as well. Going to schools, you tell stories. These kids don't believe you. They don't think this world existed. The poof was on the headline in the newspaper. Get this man out of my school, what a liar. All of that. And that as well, there's two sides to that generational. When I was doing the podcast series for the older people, and when I say older, it was all 50 plus, it was more exciting for them to be in a podcast because young people listen to them. I don't know what that is, but that's a young person thing, and I'm going to be in one. I'm going to be able to communicate through the decades to these kids. And there was great stories. Some where we apologise, this isn't what we wanted for you, and others where, again, those great stories of resilience and those trailblazing stories of allies, parents that were happy for their son to be moved in with their boyfriend in 1981, before decriminalisation, trailblazing allies and parents. But like Jay mentioned about the coming in, how because we do not have funding, because we are volunteers, this as a passion project, and we are community members, we can respond quick. We can hear what's going on, what matters, and we can respond. Just like the Coming In project, the rise of xenophobia, just after Scotland got its AAA grading, so everybody moved here, and then Brexit happened, and that was key to us because freedom of movement is so important. But then, so is this long-term activism of being able to gather the stories of right now transphobia in Scotland and politics and the impact of that on everybody that has a gender expression, which is us all, and how that can then lead us to do work this month in History Month under the theme of transgressions. And everybody here has mentioned that everybody's collections is full of transgressions, people that broke society's rules for gender or sexual orientation. And it's something that we feel a great responsibility now to respond to our community, let them tell their stories, have that therapeutic practice of saying, look, my pain and my fight and my resilience is worth collecting, it's worth having space on that gallery wall. I forgot where I was going with that, but it's also to push that solidarity within the LGBTQI+, just what you were saying, Alan, and how that's not happened because of legislation. That's happened through people's stories, people's loves, people's lives, people's deaths. And that has to be recorded to help us push forward. Because me at 35, educated through Section 28, I have no connection to my community. I have no heritage. And that is debilitating and paralysing, and we now need to break that process. And it's not just debilitating one way, it goes both ways for the older generation as well. And giving people that language, when you tell a story using they, them pronouns, and you see somebody in the audience go, oh, that just makes sense to me. And it happens in real time that they suddenly, their interface with reality changes because they now have the reality, the language to express that to someone else. And that's why doing that presenting, and may it be to an LGBT community event, or like we've done HR professional events, that always encourages people to tell their stories. We done one HR professionals, it was about coming out and how we all have to come out all the time. And it was somebody who was in a hospice who had to come out to the nurses who were palliative care throughout their death. And somebody in that audience said, my uncle died of HIV. And I never once thought that when he was in a hospice being cared for and looked after, that he might have been put through that process. And that's that woman's story. That's part of our community. She's telling part of our story, and that is that tell a story, collect a story, tell a story, collect a story, tell a story, collect a story. And then for me, who is just coming in my mind, I think about, well, who's collecting Alan's story? Who's collecting James' story? What about Dan's? Are you all being that living your own history and recording it as well? Because I think that that's what I'm doing with a piece of the work that Jane facilitates that I can do, is by saying, well, I didn't have that history, so I'm writing my history now, so people do have access to that. Maybe a bit lordy and grandiose, but that's me, and that's where I'm at. Good.
Brilliant. Round of applause. Amazing. Again, another inspiring set of stories. Have we got any questions or comments for either of these guys?
Sorry, I've been so busy listening, I haven't been paying attention.
No, it's fine. I'm just checking that there's nobody on the screens. We've had lots of comments. Thank you. So a few questions. I can go back. Where is it? We did have a question for Alan.
Oh.
I wondered, has the need to utilise less conversational recording / archives been better for engagement, or has it made things more challenging?
I guess both, in a weird sort of way. It is more challenging, but at the same time, then if you can get through that, people are totally empowered, but like Dom said, to tell their story in the way that they want to tell it. You know, there's so perhaps a bit of a challenge going off, but then I think they're instantly more empowered to say what they want to say. So I think that's, I think pluses and minuses, but more pluses than minuses, really.
Let me just carry on scrolling. Loving the idea of living archives. We are the resources. Amazing work. This is general consensus to all the speakers tonight. We had was it from Rebecca Sheldon, reminded me of a question I had from a young pupil one day when looking at Anglican marriage registers, and the fact that they were all heterosexual couples. It never occurred to her that in the past there was only people whom marriage was legally recognised. Someone's come back, and it's interesting comments. Vicky McCann from Lancashire Archives said that they've been supporting their local LGBT communities across Lancashire and worked together to collect and preserve. Unfortunately, she's had to leave. Jamie and Dom may have been able to trace some of the people from the Scottish Minorities group that come from Dr. Clifford Wilson.
Yes, we have got people who mention that group and who are members of that group, particularly the older people in our oral histories. But that's a really good point, Clifford.
Yeah, and I mean, just to everybody with the chat, you can save it if you press the little button with the 3 dots. There's loads of links being put in there from lots of people that are in the audience and from our speakers tonight, so you can go back and check out all these different websites. And I think there's some resources in there and some search guides, which is great. You can always also refer back to the Community Archive and Heritage Group website, and you can, there's email addresses to get in touch with people through that if anyone's got any questions. Right, if no one's got any further questions, because I do understand it's been quite a long session tonight, which is brilliant. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to everybody that's come along and joined us this evening, and of course an incredible thank you to our speakers and contributors this evening, and to everyone behind the scenes at CAHG that kind of helps put these kind of things on. all we can do is keep plugging away at all the work, all the amazing work that we all do, and filling up our archives with great new material. Don't forget that there is other webinars coming up in the series through the CAHG website. Keep an eye on that website. It will post up the new details of when the next one's coming along. Obviously, we're all having to get into this mood with COVID that it's all going to be online for a little while longer. Alan, do you have anything to add apart from thank yous?
No, just thank you for everyone for coming along and being part of it and sharing their stories, which actually is what we're all about, isn't it? But actually sharing with each other has just been amazing. Thank you. It's fired me up for another LGBT History Month, really. So
yep.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Right, brilliant. So that's it all for us this evening, and thank you again for attending. Thank you.
Take care. Good night, everyone, and thank you.